During this summer, we have been looking at the subject of valuing human dignity. And we spent some time looking at Psalm 8, for example, to lay out a foundation for that, for understanding from a Christian worldview why we value our humanity. But then to start to look, how does that play out? How does that apply in very particular ways in our world and the times in which we live? And so we've spent the last couple of weeks looking at the issue of racial solidarity, racial reconciliation. How do we relate to one another? This morning is really an extension of that, but stepping into a realm that is politically charged. How do we deal with the strangers among us? How do we deal with the issue of immigration and refugees? So let me start by at least doing this. If I use the term first generation, that is you yourself, okay, are an immigrant, that is either through citizenship or resident visa or work visa. If you are a first generation immigrant here to the United States, would you do me a favor and stand up? Okay. Stay standing. If you are a second generation, that is your parents were immigrants, would you stand up? Great. I stand up too. Okay? Thanks, be seated. The reason I had him do that was not so that you could identify him and call ICE, okay? All right? The reason I did that is because this issue, you can see, look, we have people who are impacted by this. Okay? That directly or either indirectly, that this has something to do with their life and the life of Faith Bible Church. So it is an important issue. And let me again just preface this. Our intent this morning is not to be partisan. It is not to try to move an agenda of a political party in particular. We've said our desire is to at least have a biblical framework, a Christian worldview with regards to this matter. And so I want you to take your Bible and go to Deuteronomy chapter 10 as a text that we'll touch on. It's certainly just one of a host of texts that could be used. Okay? The inside cover of the bulletin contains Matthew 25, and although that may seem very, very familiar, understand that's a very difficult text to interpret. It may seem simple. You say, we just got to hand out water and take care of that. No, because the context of that is eschatological. The context of that is looking ahead to the nations, judgment of nations. So we use it, but not always are we careful in our understanding and application. But here in Deuteronomy chapter 10, I want to begin reading at verse 12. As Moses again reminds the people of Israel as they're preparing to enter the land. Now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require from you but to fear the Lord your God and to walk in all his ways and to love him? To love him and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and keep the Lord's commandments and his statutes, which I'm commanding you today for your good. Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the highest heavens, the earth and all that is in it. Yet on your fathers did the Lord set his affection to love them, and he chose their descendants after them, even you above all peoples, as it is this day. So circumcise your heart and stiffen your neck no longer in terms of their disobedience. For the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who does not show partiality nor take a bribe. He executes justice for the orphan and the widow and shows his love for the alien by giving him food and clothing. So show your love for the alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God, you shall serve him and cling to him, and you shall swear by his name. He is your praise, and he is your God, who has done these great and awesome things for you, which your eyes have seen. If we start to look at the issue of immigration, refugees, there's at least some guidelines that we want to make note of as we look at this subject. First is that the Old Testament law is a legal code for the nation of Israel. It's a legal code for the nation of Israel. We've got to remember, sometimes we forget, we only look at it in spiritual terms. But we've got to remember that the people of Israel really became a nation while in Egypt. They went down with 70-something people and came out with 1 million or more. So they're going, after 400 years, into a land to become a political entity in a land. And so God is giving them, as their king, he's giving them the law, how they are to operate in the land, in their nation, as a people of God. And so it's a legal code for the people of God, for the nation of Israel. Secondly, then, you cannot take the law and apply it directly to a different nation and a different time. You can't just go into the Old Testament and to the law and say, well, that was the law, therefore we ought to do this. I mean, very simple. Let's think of the most extreme. We're not stoning people, are we? I mean, should we stone those who blaspheme? We don't take the legal code and apply it. Often, and even sometimes well-meaning Christians sometimes do that. They look into the law and they automatically try to bring it forward and say, this is true for us. Let me give you an illustration of some organizations and how this plays out. And again, it's a political hot topic, okay? Sanctuary cities. In the law, in the Old Testament, there is provision made for sanctuary cities, or cities of refuge. And some might say, well, therefore, because there were sanctuary cities, we can have sanctuary cities today. Well, that really shows that they don't understand what the purpose was within the system of law for the nation of Israel. Fundamentally, the city of refuge, or the sanctuary city, was available for someone to appeal to justice in the case of an involuntary death, causing the involuntary death of another individual. Wasn't premeditated, not intentional, but you killed somebody. You could flee to a sanctuary city to seek justice there. Because within the law code of the nation of Israel was a principle called lex talionis, which is the law of retaliation. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Okay, that's not for you to go about and personally do that. That's not what that was about. That was a means for a proper execution of justice within the social legal system. But part of that law was if somebody was killed, it was then a blood avenger who could then take the life of the one who killed his brother or his blood relative. And so in order to avoid that, the person could seek the city of refuge or the sanctuary city so that justice could be executed and he not be killed by the avenging brother. And that's not what sanctuary cities mean today. Okay? Has nothing to do with immigration. And so just to take that and apply that to today is really a misapplication of the law. However, what we can do, we can find ethical principles that transcend time and culture. We can go to the Old Testament and we can find principles from the law, from the prophets, and apply them to us, even though we live in a different time in history and a different culture. Now, there are some guidelines and principles that we need to also make with regards to understanding biblically some of the issues regarding immigration. First is that we must distinguish biblical terms: alien and foreigner and refugee. The term that's used here, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 10, you see it a number of times as the word alien. This is the primary word, the most used word in the Old Testament. It occurs either as a verb or a noun probably well over 100 times in the Old Testament. But this word has a particular nuance. And the nuance is often used in conjunction with another term, but the nuance is the idea of abiding or residing. And so it's the alien or stranger who comes and resides among the people of Israel. And so we might use the term resident alien. The other term that occurs in the Old Testament is translated foreigner. I remember I was dating Barb at the time, and we were out at her parents' having Sunday lunch, and one of Barb's good friends from college was also there at lunch. And as we're going around the table, the subject of my relationship to the U.S. Came up, and Elaine suddenly looked at me and she said, "You're a foreigner?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "You don't look foreign." I don't know what foreigners are supposed to look like. But that's how we think of the word foreigner. But the word foreigner in the Old Testament had a more particular meaning. As opposed to the one who was residing, this is one who was entering and leaving. Wasn't intending necessarily to take up residence. And so if you were a trader, if you were moving business-wise, you might go into a land, accommodate business, and then leave, and you would be considered a foreigner. If you were a nomad and you were traveling through to go to someplace else, you would be a foreigner. Invading armies, even though they may be coming to take up residence, but they were not aliens, they were foreigners. And so the term alien, stranger, and foreigner have two different meanings. One will, in essence, say was more of a legal, both are legal, but one is coming to abide, the other is not necessarily going to do that. Listen, the other term that we use is the word refugee, and that's not necessarily a biblical term. A refugee could be a foreigner, or a refugee could be an alien. The refugee is a term that speaks to those who are displaced from their place. A lot of times I've learned this terminology when I'm overseas, is particularly in some cultures, you don't say, "Where's your home?" You say, "Where's your place?" So from their place, they have been displaced. Now, they can be displaced in their own country. They can be displaced in a neighboring country. They can be displaced in a country further removed. But they are displaced usually by natural disaster, by war, or by persecution. So they're displaced peoples. A displaced person, a refugee, can be an immigrant or can be a foreigner. One of the things that becomes clear from the scriptures and historically is that nations have the right to secure borders and the right to allow and deny access. That nations have the right and the practice of securing borders and allowing or denying access. We know, for example, there are many examples in the scriptures where there are borders of countries, of regions, of areas. Kingdoms have borders. And those borders were often secured. Most often, when you moved from one place to another, you were traveling one of the major highways, one of the highways of trade or commerce. And as you moved from place to place, there would have been a fortress. There would have been some kind of fort manned by the land, the country, that you were entering. They used that to secure their borders from invading armies or for access to their country. And they had the right, and they did practice either a means for denying or allowing access into their land. The Egyptians were especially adept at this. And we know biblically that's the case. That when people came to go into a land, they often, you see examples where they asked permission. Abraham asked permission. He sought legal standing in places, and others did the same thing. We remember in the Exodus where the people were looking to move through Edom, and they were denied access. Okay? Now, God judged them later for that. But nations had the right to allow or to deny access to their lands. And you see illustrations of that biblically. But those who are resident aliens were to be subject to the laws of the land and had the right to expect protection and justice. And that's what you see here in Deuteronomy 10. Those who came as resident aliens, the law of Israel made provision for them that they should be able to have rights of justice and protection. But that doesn't mean they had all rights of citizens. They didn't. They had many rights, but not all. Kind of like this. For those of you who don't know, this is a green card. Currently is green. There were times in the past where it was pink and yet called a green card. This card allows me to reside in this country. And as a resident alien, I am given protection, and I am allowed to expect justice. I am expected to abide by the laws of this land. But it doesn't give me the rights of citizenship. There are rights that you have as a citizen that I do not get to enjoy legally. I don't get to vote legally. Okay? I've never voted, so there you go, okay? I told the first hour I have to be very careful. Those of you who don't know, one of my sons is a legislative director for a congressman in Washington, and he says to me, he says, "Dad, please be careful what you say in public, please." I just call it taxation without representation. And you guys fought a war over that, okay? I'm expected to produce this upon demand. I carry it with me, and legally, I'm expected to produce this on demand. So you don't have to produce your documentation for people on demand as a citizen. I do. I'll give you an illustration. This week, I had to go and get my license renewed. And the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, as he's going through things, he says, "Oh, do you have your card?" I said, "Yes, I do." Had to produce the card and give it to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles in order to get a new license. I'm expected to abide by the laws. I have the guarantee of justice. I have the guarantee of certain rights and privileges, but not all. And that was true also for the nation of Israel. As you work through there were many of the laws that applied to the foreigner or to the alien, to the stranger, and they didn't necessarily apply to the foreigner. They were like resident aliens who were granted legal access and residency in Israel or in the land. Okay, we're looking at this from a Christian worldview, and so what does Deuteronomy 10 contribute to this? I said certainly there are any number of texts that we could have turned to. I turned to this one. Because what becomes clear in verse 17 is the Lord your God is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God. That the authority that we appeal to is the transcendence of God. A God who is transcendent, who transcends time, and a God who transcends culture. All things, all that is in the world belong to Him. He is the final authority. And so we are subject to Him. And we always want to make that clear. That He is God of gods, Lord of lords. All are subject to Him. So we always appeal, theocentrically, to the authority and the transcendence of God. It doesn't matter where you live, it doesn't matter what times of history you live in, you're responsible to this God. Now, sometimes then, we talk about civil disobedience. We need to understand what that entails and to make sure that that law that we're being asked to follow is indeed contradictory to the law of God, to appeal to the higher authority. Secondly, is the character of God Himself. He does not show partiality or take a bribe. He executes justice, the orphan, the widow, and the alien. He loves the alien. Moses, God appeals to His character. Often what you'll find in the Old Testament is the grouping orphan, widow, alien. Those who are the defenseless, those who have no other appeal because in social settings, God defends them because they are subject to injustice. They can often be abused and become victims of those in authority. And He says, look, God is just in how He deals with people. And He doesn't take bribes. He's impartial. I've known cases where people have been here, may not have been legal in their coming, have worked, and because of their standing, have been abused by their employer. What do you mean abused? They're not paid minimum wage. They work extra hours, and nobody pays their taxes. That's abuse. That's not just. When you deal with the alien, you are to deal with them in a just manner because God is just. And because God loves the alien just as he loves the citizen. Thirdly, we must remember God's redemptive work. Here he appeals to the people of Israel. He says, show your love for the alien because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. When they went down into Egypt, they went having been granted permission to enter because of Joseph. They took up residence. After a while, there arises a Pharaoh who doesn't know, and he begins to abuse the people of Israel. And God redeems them through the Exodus. And he says to them, remember, you were aliens and how you were treated in the land of Egypt, but I redeemed you. Listen, for us, it's the same thing. We need to remember that we were aliens, we were enemies, we were foreigners, we were outside the covenants of promise. We were on the outside, and yet God has redeemed us. And so we must always remember our own history. Fourthly, God appoints human authority in government, and we're to be subject to those. Romans 13. Although God is supreme, he does mediate his rule through human institutions of government, and he has appointed them. They are sovereignly appointed, and they will all answer to God. They'll give an account to him for how they execute justice that is to represent the justice of God. And we're to be subject to them. We're told as believers over and over and over again, be subject to those who govern over you. Let me come back to sanctuary cities. The Immigration Act of 1996 specifically says in its act that local law enforcement authorities must cooperate with federal immigration authorities when dealing with illegal aliens, particularly those who perform a criminal act. And so when a mayor specifically tells his law enforcement agencies not to abide by the law of the land, he cannot appeal to civil disobedience. He is refusing to be subject to the laws of the land. He is the one who swears to uphold the Constitution and the laws of this land. He is blatantly violating a very clear law. Again, sanctuary cities, very different biblically than what it means today. And so the people of Israel were to follow the commands of God. They were subject to them because that was their legal code. They were subject to them because God had given them, but they were to exercise the laws, remembering his character and remembering his work. Now, there are a number of Christian organizations that are working in the area of immigration reform. There is a need for immigration reform. Most of the immigration laws of this country were written in 1965. And so there is a need for reform. There is a proposal that's been put forth and signed by more than 2,000 evangelical or Christian leaders or organizations. This particular proposal, I think, reflects a biblical worldview. There are 6 major points to it. First, to respect the God-given dignity of every person. We believe people are created in the image of God. It doesn't matter where they're from, that they are created in the image of God, and we ought to respect their dignity. Secondly, one that protects the unity of the immediate family. Husbands, wives, children, possibly brothers, sisters, moms and dads. Immediate family. Hey, listen, we've had situations here at Faith Bible Church where U.S. citizens have married somebody from overseas. They don't get to put them on a plane and bring them here. Some of them have had to wait for up to 2 years to have their spouse join them here in the U.S. There are some things that need to be reformed and changed to protect the unity of the immediate family. Third, one that respects the rule of law. We respect law because God has set up government over us, and we're to be subject to it. Fourth, that guarantees national borders, secure national borders. Again, biblically, we think that is granted to the governing authority to secure their borders for the protection of their people. Fifth, ensure fairness to taxpayers, that the burden of illegal immigration doesn't become a burden to the citizens of the country. And sixth, one that establishes a path toward legal status and/or citizenship for those who qualify and who wish to become permanent residents. This is a hot button. Listen, when people see that, we say that's amnesty. We're not talking amnesty. This is not amnesty. There is a realistic approach that says, look, we are not going to deport every illegal immigrant to this country. You cannot afford it. But there is a process that ought to be in place to deal with those who are here residing. One that certainly vets those who qualify, who want to become permanent residents. In summary, basically three things. One is that it makes it harder to immigrate or work unlawfully. Second, makes it easier to immigrate lawfully. And lastly, allows those who are currently present to earn the chance to get right with the law. This is a proposal that's been given and signed by a number of Christians here in the U.S. So what do we do personally? Here's some things we can do. Number one, welcome the stranger. What I mean by legal and illegal. When somebody comes walking into Faith Bible Church, you're not asking them, hey, are you here legally or illegally? Okay? That's not what we're looking for. It doesn't matter. Okay? We're not asking people to produce their documentation. How do we respond to people? Do we welcome the stranger? Secondly, we can be involved missionally. And by that I mean this: neighborliness. Beyond just in the streets, beyond just in places of work, but even in our own neighborhoods and the places where we are interacting much more with those who are strangers or aliens. Neighborliness. Listen, the word hospitality in the Greek means lover of strangers. It isn't about having somebody over for coffee, tea, or feeding them dinner. It's how do you address and how do you deal with those who are strangers. We can demonstrate hospitality with those in our sphere of influence. Second, we've talked here about the international student ministry. This year, not only are your kids going back to school, but UC is starting very soon. And enrolling at UC this year are going to be, I don't know, a couple of thousand international students. And we've heard about that work. This is an opportunity to maybe get engaged with international student ministry, to show hospitality, to show neighborliness. But ultimately, it's missional, hopefully, to be able to share the gospel. God providentially is moving people into your neighborhoods and into our city so that the gospel of Jesus Christ can be proclaimed to them. Maybe we're coming from places where they would never hear the gospel. If you're interested in refugee work, particularly the idea of some of the refugees, then the one organization in Southwest Ohio that has been designated as the main means for dealing with legal asylum and refugees is Catholic Charities of Southwest Ohio. You don't have to be Catholic to be involved, but they are the ones, if you are interested in the work amongst the refugees, that is who you contact. You can be involved legally. That is, you can be involved politically. This country does allow for a platform and a means to redress certain issues legally within the system that's been established. You can call for not reformation reform, but immigration reform. And there are two organizations that you can get information from. One is called the Evangelical Immigration Table. The other is called World Relief. Either one of those would be glad to give you more information. Fourthly, you can be involved representatively. What I mean representatively is it's the issue of refugees. Many times there are organizations that are working with refugees who are displaced in their own place or in a neighboring country, places that you and I will never get to. Organizations like Matthew 25 or Samaritan's Purse. And you can partner with them through financial gifts or means of information or other projects they may be able to give you information on that you can then partner with them with regards to the refugee issue. There's another, and that is on the way out, you can pick up a little bookmark. There it is. The Evangelical Immigration Table has put out a 40-day challenge. The challenge is that there are 40 passages of Scripture that deal with the issue of the stranger, that deal with the issue of the refugee, foreigner, and they've listed them. And the 40-day challenge is that over 40 days you would each read each one of the passages. And so those are available on the back table as you leave. And then if you're willing to take the challenge, you can do that over the course of the next 40 days. There are also resources. Here are a couple of books that are worth it: The Immigration Crisis and Seeking Refuge, written from a Christian worldview. Now listen, it's Communion Sunday, and so as we gather here, there are things we need to remember very, very clearly about Christ and about how we relate to Christ. We were foreigners, we were aliens, we were strangers. But he's been brought us near by his blood. So let me just qualify something first off. I'm not the only resident alien in this room. You all are. Paul said, for our citizenship is where? In heaven. We are all resident aliens as believers. Okay? Our citizenship is in heaven, and even though we don't have a right to it, it's been earned for us through Christ Jesus. I didn't bring my passport this morning. My passport looks different than Barb's. If I open my passport, there's something very, very significant in that. It says British citizen, and that's very significant because that is what gives me the right of abode. Your right of abode for eternity in heaven with Christ is because you are a citizen of heaven, and that has been bought for you, secured for you through Jesus Christ. That's the only way. There are no illegal immigrants in eternity. Okay? So, if you're here this morning and you are hoping to get into heaven another way, it doesn't work. You need to believe in the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, the one who has secured that for you. Secondly, we often hear the term, Jesus was a refugee, and sometimes that's misapplied or misunderstood. But in one sense, Jesus is a refugee, or was a refugee. When he was a baby, his parents were displaced by the acts of an evil wicked king. And his parents took him to Egypt, where he lived in Egypt, having been granted permission to enter. And he lived in Egypt until it was safe enough to return to his home. In that way, Jesus was a refugee. And I'm reminded of the words of the writer of the Hebrews that says, listen, we have a great high priest, one who has passed through the heavens, one who can truly sympathize with us in our weaknesses, because he was tested in every way as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, come to him to receive mercy and grace to help in your time of need. A message that we have to take to those who are displaced, moving from place to place, is that there is a Savior who identifies with them because he himself was a refugee. He knows. And he administers grace and mercy to help in their time of need. It still becomes an opportunity to point them to Jesus. And as we gather around a table this morning, a common table, this is a table for the citizens of heaven, a feast for them to remember the one who has secured their citizenship through his own death, resurrection, and coming again. Not an easy subject, fraught with many potholes and pitfalls. But as believers, we do have a way, a worldview that shapes biblically how we are to respond and how we are to engage.